I'm Liz. This is Dispatches from React Native. Who thought I was going to talk about Redux based on that? Yeah, I'm not. I briefly talk about it. I was referring to the original noun of like sending a message. But this is about supporting Android with React Native. I am a JavaScript developer at Mad Mobile. I am also involved with a lot of different organizations. Tech Ladies, formerly Girl Develop It, as well as Suncoast Developers Guild. I like to throw them out there. They are an excellent code school in St. Pete. And I am also a proud cat mom to far too many cats. And I always put an obligatory cat photo up there. That is Gizmo, Gadget, Hopper, and Shadowcat. And yes, they all but Shadowcat have Disney-related names. Hopper short for Dinglehopper. You can see why I'm here, right? Okay, so for this past year, I have had the honor of working on an app that we were building for the Cisco food supplier, and we were doing it all in React Native. And the whole point of this app was that it's to replace their current one that our company had built years ago. And that app goes through $4 billion of revenue every year. So this was a really big app, and taking on React Native was a really interesting challenge, especially as it's still a pretty new technology. So what's up with React Native and Android? Has anyone tried to build React Native apps for Android? How many people have wanted to punch their computer while doing it? Yes, it's not that fun. No, it's actually a lot of fun. But there are a lot of issues with it, and a lot of them things that we've had to kind of hack around, come up with. So this talk is primarily focusing on things that we kind of learned along the way, and I came into this about a year into it. But things that we've had to do, issues that we have discovered, and just all sorts of things. Does anyone remember reading Sunsetting React Native from Airbnb? It came out last June. Yes. And I jokingly call this is the post-herd round, the React Native world. This was a big deal because Airbnb has been doing a lot of support, a lot of development for React Native, and they're one of these huge companies that they're suddenly deciding that they're no longer going to do React Native. They're going to go back to working with an iOS, a web, and an Android set of teams instead of being collaborative. And this actually is one post that they then break out into 4 or 5. I'm just going to summarize some of them, like their main points. But they said that their issue was that they were not reaching their goals. And because they were not reaching their goals, they were going to sunset React Native. Their first goal was they wanted to move faster. They wanted to maintain the quality bar. They wanted to write code once instead of twice. And they wanted to improve the developer experience. And you can go and you can read all of them. I have the links for it. But basically, they were finding that they were still, because it was a new technology, they were having to develop a lot of things. They had to build a lot of things out. And this was, when I read it, I was slightly concerned because they had created different packages like React Navigation and things that we were using. And it was like, well, if they're not going to support, if Airbnb is not going to support React Native, who's going to take over it? They do have a plan. They've handed it over to the community. So all's going great. But this got me thinking, because about 3 weeks later, I was at Chain React, which is a React Native conference. And this was what a lot of people were talking about, because it was very big news. And the other thing I kept noticing was that a lot of those companies, like people who were speaking, they were saying how their company was continuing with iOS in React Native, but they weren't going to continue. A lot of them had already brought back on a separate Android team, and they were just going to build Android on its own. They weren't going to do the React Native experiment anymore. And that was something that really got me thinking. So when it came up, I had this question of why are companies dropping React Native for Android and returning to native development? I spoke to my team about it. We've had a lot of discussions. And I came up with about, I think it's 4 or 5. We'll go through them. My team's perspective of why people are giving up on React Native for Android. Or maybe not giving up, but deciding it's not worth the investment. There's a lot of JSX sensitivity. I'll get into all of these more in a second. The configuration for custom modules, Expo, styling and animations, and this iOS first kind of philosophy and feel to it. So first up with JSX sensitivity, this is something I have definitely come across many, many times. And we will have beautiful code and everything's written up in iOS, and then we go to our Android build and suddenly everything's crashing and it just falls apart on us. So we learned that you had to be really careful about your nulls. Everything had to be null safe. Also that short circuit operators, the and, doesn't really work when you're putting it right into the JSX. You have to put things as ternaries, or Android, for the way that React Native is built, doesn't like it and it just breaks. I spent basically a 2-week sprint trying to remind everyone of this after I went through and cleaned up a ton of code, and I was like, no, stop it, bad developer, you cannot do that, and told them they had to make everything as a ternary. So the next one that we had was detached Expo, and this is from the Expo docs on why you maybe shouldn't detach, and it's, you shouldn't detach if you enjoy the painless React Native upgrades that come with Expo. After your app is detached, breaking changes in React Native will affect your project differently, and you may need to figure them out for your particular situation. This is what caused most of our problems. We had to create some very specific custom modules. So we actually had to go in and create certain things in Java for the iOS. We had to go in and do it all. And that meant we had to detach from Expo. I believe we also started the app with the create React Native app start, and that got folded into Expo, so we kind of got stuck with it. It's one of those that, depending on what you want, if you were gonna look at this and create a React Native app for yourself, I would consider if I was gonna do the React Native CLI or if I was gonna do Expo, depending on what they had, because if they have slightly different package authors on them and you're kind of stuck into one or you're into the detaching. And we were a team of 5 JavaScript developers and people were learning Java on the fly. And it was not easy. So the other one, and this is the one that people were, This is the one that people have been coming up and talking to me about, that they wanted to talk about styling and animations and what were my solutions for them. So for styling, we actually used, it's a package called React Native Device Detection. We had to actually build our own, but we have this is part of what we brought in. As you see, it's just simple, is iOS or Android? It pulls it through, and basically we were styling everything depending on if it was iOS or Android. I have this is a simple header, but as you see, we have, if it's Android, we're doing font weight body. If it wasn't Android, we're using font weight title 2. So unfortunately, that package has not been updated in a year. So then we had to actually start trying to do, when we had to include Android tablet, and I'm sorry, that is all squished. But we had to actually start creating our own. So we took this package and we based ours around it. And we also, then when they released the XR and the XS, we had to start pulling those in as well because they all had different sizes. We all had to work on different things. I have done so many UI audits where I've had to just go in and change a header, change a font size, get rid of the bold, because even though you put it in and the best you can do, it's when it goes out over that JavaScript thread, that's when you start having all sorts of issues. Now for animations. You wanna know my secret? There is no secret. If you want to do animations in Android, you better just learn how to do it in Android. I spent a month trying to come up with the most elegant and beautiful animations, only to have my Android build not do any of them. There's a lot of things you can do. You can debug. You use native driver for a lot of the animations, and you kind of just have to build them your own. This falls in under also if you're building your own custom modules, that you have to go in and you have to dig into those XML files, which, since most of you are probably Java or Android, you're probably like, Liz, that's the easiest thing in the world. I don't know why you're freaking out about it. But the whole point was that we were JavaScript developers who were able to build this app. And then this is the biggest one, and this is actually, I think, kind of the more controversial point that I have in all this, is that I do believe that there's this iOS first mentality when it comes to React Native. I don't know if it's exactly coming from Facebook, if it's coming from the React Native people, but a lot of apps, or a lot of the packages and a lot of the fixes seem to be kind of shoehorned in for Android. And so you kind of have to, when you start looking at it, you have to, from the beginning, be prepared for that, which is something my team was not. They didn't really think about that. But then as we built it out, basically all of our data manipulation, all of that fun stuff behind the scenes, all of that was fine. We had no problem with it. But when it comes to UI, when it comes to UX, that's when you have to really start fiddling around with Android and getting it working. This is also that part of it was our design team were always giving us our files that we were trying to recreate from Zeppelin. They would give it to us, and they were all designed for iOS. They'd be like, here's for the iPhone, and then it'd be like, well, for the Android, they're like, oh, make it look like the iPhone. So I've had to go in and actually change cursor colors, change a whole bunch of things. Betty's shaking her head, going, no, 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 that's not how you do it. So that is actually the biggest thing, is that you have to have two separate plans for it. And I'll come back to that in a second. So is React Native worth it for Android? I say yes. I say that with a caveat. I say that in the sense of my team was all JavaScript. Everyone else in the office is primarily working in JavaScript. Our main product that we're sending out that we provide is actually React and Cordova. So us doing React Native was kind of like this cool, really awesome thing, but they couldn't afford to bring in well, they probably could, but they didn't want to bring in just a bunch of Java devs to do this. They didn't want to bring in just a bunch of iOS devs. They wanted it to be something that we could do in-house. And I will say that we did about 90% of the work without having to touch anything native. We had to touch native when we started messing around with Mixpanel. We had a lot of issues with that. And we had to provide for the client a external keyboard set of shortcuts where they could, do Command T, Command S, and all that. That when we had to do that, we had to build it out. And unfortunately, we never got it fully built out into Android. We have handed this over to Cisco, so their devs are now finishing it up, which is part of why some of this didn't get finished up. So as I said, our experience based on Airbnb's goals, does everyone remember what those were? I'm going to put them back up, so don't worry. It was that they felt they weren't moving faster, that they weren't maintaining the quality bar, they would write code once instead of twice, and that it didn't necessarily improve the developer experience because of all these other issues. We were doing daily builds. We were sending things to our client to test every day. It was beautiful. I was in charge of it. I was out there making sure it was getting done every day. We had fantastic quality code that when they brought in their in-house team of devs, that they had to start adopting our way of doing it because we had maintained such high quality. We wrote the code once. We didn't have to write it twice. Again, we couldn't write it twice. That again goes back to things like that, those shortcuts that didn't necessarily get fully implemented into Android. And I think it really improved the developer experience. Personally, I never thought, just doing JavaScript, that I would be able to actually make an app that wasn't a progressive web app, that wasn't wrapped in Cordova, something that I would pull up on my phone and show people, and it felt like a native app. And I think that is what is fantastic about this. I do think there's some things you should keep in mind if you're looking at doing a React Native app, especially for Android, that React Native isn't a replacement, that this isn't going to go out there and suddenly everyone's going to be building everything on React Native. Obviously, not everyone's doing it, but that was never the plan of it. it also isn't actually meant to turn JavaScript developers into native developers. And I think that's actually a really big misconception, is that, like I said, that's so cool. I was like, look, I made an app. This is amazing. I would tell people I thought it was so awesome. But I'm not a native developer. And that is something that a lot of people find confusing, that they think, oh, well, yeah, this is going to take over it. No, it's not. We still have to be separate. I think ideally a team would be you would have JavaScript developers, and then you'd have at least one or two, like one Android and one iOS dev, that would go in there and do that cleanup. That when you needed to do something in it, that they were there, that they could clean it up, that they could make sure it was all working. And this is where I think sometimes some teams and some organizations, and I'm not exactly sure if this is what happened at Airbnb, but part of how it came across was that they were trying to combine it all together. When they still need to have those teams, they still need to have that separation. And the other thing is you have to plan for those differences from the beginning. As I've been saying, you have to know that things are going to look differently. And if you don't want them to look differently, you need to be able to have someone come in and actually do that programming. Because you have to dig in there, and React Native gives you lots of ways to customize things. But I will tell you, a toggle button, trying to get an Android toggle button to look like an iOS button is impossible. Again, Betty's shaking her head like, no, been there, done that. So as long as you know that they're two different user experiences, then it's fantastic, and it works that way. And that's it. I told you I would get you out here at 6:32. So I want to thank you all for coming. Does anyone have any questions?